But I'm Tim from Fontanelle Forest, and today we're going to talk about winter birds. So some of the birds you might see in the wintertime in Nebraska. So some of our birds, about 50% of our birds actually migrate during the winter, but a lot of our birds stick around. And some of our birds actually that we see in the winter migrate, believe it or not, to Nebraska. When they fly south, Nebraska is their south. And sometimes people think, oh, you know, birds migrate because they can't handle the cold. And that's not exactly true. That's indirectly, that's the reason. The cold is indirectly the reason, but really the reason that birds migrate or stick around is the same reason that animals hibernate, and it's all about food. So birds that can get food in the wintertime generally stick around. But if they're a bird that eats insects, say, primarily, or birds that, like hummingbirds that feed on nectar and pollen, you know, obviously in Nebraska in the middle of December and January, there's not a lot of insects hanging around. There's not a lot of pollen. So those birds need to fly south in order to find food. So it's more about the food source than it is about the cold. Now, if you have bird feeders out, there's bird feeders come in a lot of different styles. This is a pretty common style here on the upper right. You put seed in there and the bird can perch on it. This one, kind of the same way, seed falls into this tray. I think this is a neat feeder, and these are evening grosbeaks. So, you know, they come and feed on that in big flocks. So if you put food out, you know, you're more likely to see birds in your backyard. Some other styles of feeder. This is a thistle feeder here on the left. You see these beautiful goldfinches and a little house finch, and those are for a very tiny seed like Niger, which tends to be a little pricey, but if you really want to attract finches, especially goldfinches, that's a good type of feeder to have. A peanut feeder, so not in the shell peanuts, but shelled peanuts you can put in here. You can see it has a little bit bigger holes and has a nuthatch here that loves those, and we're going to talk about nuthatches. This is just a tray style feeder up here in the upper right. This on the right hand side here, this is a suet feeder. So suet is just kind of rendered fat, and they embed seeds and corn and things like that in it, and a lot of birds really like that, especially our woodpeckers, and this is a downy woodpecker here. So let's talk a little more about some of our birds that we're going to see. This is a very common bird to see at a feeder, especially in wintertime and even in summertime. This is a white-breasted nuthatch. They're easily identifiable because they're one of the few birds that will perch on twigs or feed head down. They actually do this upside down, and they'll hop down a tree upside down with their head down. And sometimes people say that they catch going down what a woodpecker misses going up. But they'll take a seed from your feeder and they'll fly up to the tree. And if you watch them, it's really neat. They'll take the seed, they'll fly up to the tree, and they'll jam that seed in a crevice in the bark, and then they'll hammer it. They'll strike it with their beak until it opens and they can get the kernel out. So they're really kind of a neat bird to watch. And they have a song or a call that sounds kind of like a laugh or a giggle. So pretty recognizable. Now, they have a cousin, the red-breasted nuthatch. And when I said at the beginning that sometimes birds migrate south to Nebraska, believe it or not, and this is one of them. The white-breasted the red-breasted nuthatch is sometimes seen at feeders in the wintertime. It generally stays farther north, but if the snow cover is heavy and they have trouble finding food, then they might come south for the winter. And they have a little bit different call than the white-breasted nuthatch. So very similar, but a little bit different. Now this is one of my favorite birds. This is the blue jay. Not everybody likes blue jays. Blue jays are kind of considered bullies. Sometimes people call them mean because they're kind of loud. They're kind of obnoxious. They don't have a pretty songbird type song. This is what they sound like. And I love that. To me, that sounds like wilderness, that kind of raucous cry. And they're a member of the corvid family. They're related to ravens and crows and magpies. They're very, very smart birds. Those are some of the smartest birds around. But one of the really cool things about blue jays is that they can also imitate other birds. So, and they'll do what's called mobbing. So if there's an owl or a hawk in the woods, then they'll gather around them. They'll gather around in large numbers, and you'll hear them crying like that. So if you hear a whole bunch of blue jays, if you're out hiking in the forest and you hear a whole bunch of blue jays making noise like that, and you follow that sound, there's a very good chance you're going to find either a hawk or an owl. Sometimes other things like foxes also they'll kind of mob. But the other thing that blue jays will do is they'll imitate the calls of hawks. So they can imitate hawks, and sometimes they do that as a way to warn other birds in the forest. So they'll see a hawk, they'll start to imitate the hawk, and that's a way of saying, hey, there's a hawk around, everybody better watch out. But now blue jays are also kind of stinkers, so they will sometimes imitate a hawk when there's no hawk around. And that seems to be a way to scare other birds off so that then they can have all the food. And I actually got to witness this. I have hawks in the woods behind my house, and I've heard them and seen them at the same time. I've seen the hawks perched in the tops of trees crying out. And one morning I heard one, and my wife said, "What's that?" I said, "Oh, it's one of the hawks. I wonder where it is." And this blue jay came flying in and perched at the top of the tree, and it started calling like a hawk. So I guess it's not a hawk, it was just a blue jay. They can also imitate cats. So blue jays that have been raised around cats, they can imitate a meowing cat. And if you want to entertain yourself later, go on YouTube, look up blue jay imitating cat, and there's several videos of blue jays meowing, which is pretty cool. Now, another fun fact about blue jays is they're not technically blue. So they have no blue pigment in their feathers. There's no blue pigment there. So yellow birds, like our goldfinches, they have a yellow pigment in their feather. Blue jays have no blue pigment. So the blue in their feathers is a result of the light reflecting off the inner structure of the feather, and it reflects back those blue wavelengths. Now I'm going to try to show you something here, if I can make it work. It's kind of hard to see on the camera. I actually have a blue jay feather here that I found in my woods, and I'm going to shine my flashlight on it kind of from a distance, because otherwise it freaks out the camera. So you can see you can kind of see that it's blue. But if you look at it from the back, it's gray. So those feathers are actually gray in color, pigment-wise, but the way the light reflects off it makes it look like, or makes it, those blue wavelengths shoot back and makes it appear blue. So pretty cool stuff. Now, like I said, they're very smart birds. They like peanuts. They can crack open that peanut shell and get the peanut out. Now they've done studies with blue jays. They had a whole bunch of blue jays. They had them in cages, and they would put food just out of reach outside of the cage. And some of the blue jays started tearing strips of paper off the bottom of their cage, and they would use that as a tool to move the food closer. Sometimes they'd use feathers that had fallen off, and they would move that food closer. Now, not only are they smart enough to do that, but other birds, other jays in the colony who were also in cages saw this, and they learned from watching their counterparts do it. So very, very clever birds. And here's a whole bunch of blue jays. These are starlings, these dark birds. Not everybody likes starlings. They are an invasive species. But you know, when you put out seed, you kind of get what you get, and you don't throw a fit, as I like to say. So now this is another favorite. Everybody loves a chickadee. They're tiny little birds, little black and white, black-capped chickadee. And they have a pretty call. They're named for their call because their call sounds like chickadee-dee-dee. Well, actually, let me play the chickadee-dee. There it is. Chickadee-dee-dee. They also have this whistle. And that's the one you hear a lot first thing in the morning, that whistling call. Now they'll come to your feeder, they'll grab a seed, they'll fly up to a branch, and they'll put that seed under their foot, and they'll hold it with their foot to crack it open. And they're attracted to quite a variety of feeders, and this is a really neat feeder that I like. And this is one I wanna try to learn how to make this one, because I think that's really cool. Now, one of the most frequently seen woodpeckers at backyard feeders in the winter is the Downy Woodpecker. And on the left here we have a female. On the right we have the male. The male has that red patch there. And a lot of times they'll be part of what's called a mixed species flock. So they don't necessarily make flocks of woodpeckers, but they'll join other flocks. And that just helps protect them from predation. It helps, you know, there's lots of eyes to keep an eye out for predators. They really like suet, so this is one of the most frequently seen woodpeckers on your backyard suet feeder if you put that out. The male and female will actually divide up feeding areas. The male will feed on the smaller branches and places, which is actually better places to find food, and he's kind of a jerk. He'll exclude the female from feeding on those. The female has to go to those less desirable feeding areas. And they actually have taken like a woodlot, and they've captured and removed all the males, and as soon as all the males are gone, the females go right to those better feeding places. Now in the summertime, about 75% of their diet is insects. And they'll, just like other woodpeckers, they peck under the bark looking for grubs or bugs or insect eggs or whatever. But they really like the suet and the seeds in the wintertime. And suet is very high energy food, which these birds need to keep warm in the winter. Now in the 50s and 60s, they fed heavily on the elm bark beetle, which was responsible for Dutch elm disease. And now our big predator, or our big invasive tree pest, is the emerald ash borer. So they feed heavily on the emerald ash borer. So they're really good to have around because they help to control some of those invasive pests. Now another of my favorites, the red-headed woodpecker. So here's their call. Well, that's the hammering, sorry. So they love suet, they love seeds, corn, acorns, any kind of nut. And they're one of 4 woodpeckers in North America that are known to cache food. So they'll find food and then they'll store it. And they're the only one that's known to cover their cache with wood or bark. So they actually hide their cache of food. Now they really benefited also from the chestnut blight and from Dutch elm disease, because it left a lot of dead trees for them to not only feed in, but to nest in and to build cavities. So one of the ways they defend their territory is by hammering. A lot of woodpeckers do this. So that loud hammering is actually a way for them to defend their territory. It's not, when you hear that loud hammering, that's not them looking for insects or digging a nest, because that's a much more deliberate tapping and striking and digging around. That hammering is a way to communicate. It's a way of saying, hey, this is my territory, you need to stay out. And they'll do that on trees, metal stovepipes, and old cars, things like that. I've seen them on the tops of streetlights. And the first time I saw it, I thought, well, that bird's an idiot. It's not going to get any insects out of that streetlight. But it actually was hammering on the top of that streetlight because it was loud. And they've measured that sound, and it can be heard from as far away as half a mile. So again, that's a way to communicate that that's their territory, and to scare off invaders. And they're actually fierce defenders of their territory. They're kind of mean. They'll remove other birds' eggs from their nest, or invade their nest and puncture their eggs. And they've been around a while. They've been around for about 2 million years. They found fossils in Illinois, Virginia, and Florida that date back to about 2 million years ago of red-headed woodpeckers. Now this red-headed woodpecker, this is my favorite red-headed woodpecker of all time. And I don't know if he's angry, if it's happy. For all I know, in red-headed woodpecker language, this could be a string of curse words, but it makes me happy every time. I prefer to think that this woodpecker is just happy to be alive. So you just gotta love that woodpecker. Now another one of our woodpeckers that we have around here is the yellow-shafted flicker, or the northern flicker. So a lot of times you actually see them on the ground. They prefer to feed on the ground. They'll dig under leaf litter looking for grubs or insects, particularly in the warmer months. They have like most woodpeckers, they have a barbed tongue, so their tongue shoots out and actually pierces their prey, and they can eat it. Now, in the wintertime, they'll eat seeds and fruit and things like that. And you're probably wondering why they're called the yellow-shafted flicker, but this is why. If you see this bird from underneath, it has these beautiful yellow feathers. So really neat. Now, another favorite, of course, is the cardinal. We all love cardinals, and especially when you see them in the winter against that white, snowy background. It's just amazing.
Hi, I had a question about the flicker.
Oh, okay.
I thought that was called the northern flicker. Did it like change names?
No, it's the same. It's sometimes called a yellow-shafted flicker, sometimes called a northern flicker. So same bird, but just different names.
Okay, and the red-headed woodpecker, I had another question. I have never seen those here in Nebraska. Where are they? Are they in Fontenelle Forest? Because
yes.
I've never had one come to my feeders or anything.
Oh yeah, they're in Fontenelle Forest. My house backed up to the forest, and I get them on my suet feeder all the time.
Oh, that's exciting. Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. So the cardinal is another favorite, always beautiful against the white background. And on the left here is the female, so a little more drab in color than the male, the bright red male. And that's common in a lot of birds, and that's because the female needs to be more camouflaged. When she's sitting on the nest, she's vulnerable. So this bright red bird, as I'm sure you know, especially in the winter time or in the spring before the leaves come out, is very visible. So the female needs to be a little more camouflaged. Like I said, it's a popular bird. They are the state bird. The cardinal is the state bird of 7 different states. Now the female cardinal is one of the few female songbirds that actually sings. Most of the time when you hear a songbird, it's the male singing, and that's either for communication or to attract a mate. But the female cardinal sings, and she sings while sitting on the nest, and that's her way of saying, hey baby, I'm sitting on your eggs here, bring me some food. So she communicates to the male when it's time to bring food to the nest. And the pair will share song phrases, but the female song tends to be a little longer and a little more complex. So let's take a listen. Here's the female. And here's the male. Now again, like the red-headed woodpecker, the male cardinal during breeding season will fiercely defend his territory. In fact, when he sees another cardinal in a window or a mirror, which is actually himself, he might fight that other cardinal for hours. So again, if you go on YouTube, you can find videos of cardinals going after themselves in mirrors, but that's why he doesn't know that that's not his reflection, and he's trying to drive that other cardinal away. Now when courting in the spring, he also brings her food, and again, this is his way of showing, you know, hey, I'm a good provider, I know where to find food, and I can bring it to you while you're sitting on the nest. So they're really kind of sweet, and they're so pretty. And they're expanding their range. They actually didn't used to winter in Nebraska, but because people feed them and because the winters have been getting milder, they are expanding their range farther north. I think this is a neat bird too. This is the dark-eyed Junco. And again, this is another bird that migrates to Nebraska, believe it or not. There are some birds that think Nebraska's great in the wintertime. So they migrate to Nebraska. And you'll find these on the ground usually. So they come in different variations of color. This brownish one is called the Oregon phase. And then you have kind of a darker gray and a lighter gray. And they're ground feeders, so they like to pick up the seed on the ground. You'll see them under your feeder, not necessarily on it. You'll see them under your feeder picking up the seed that other birds have knocked onto the ground. Or if you have one of the tray style feeders, sometimes they'll actually go up to the tray, kick seed onto the ground, and then they'll fly down to the ground to eat it. And here's what they sound like. And I see those frequently in the wintertime under my feeders. Now there's a bird. You might know what this is. This is, of course, the goldfinch. So this kind of drabbish color, again, is their winter plumage. And goldfinches are the only finch that molts twice a year. So they molt in the fall or early winter from that bright yellow to this more drab color. So even the males molt into this drab color. And that again is camouflage, because this is the summer plumage. This bright yellow, when all the leaves are off the trees and everything is kind of brown, that would stand out and they would be in danger of getting eaten by a lot of things. Now they are partially migratory. They will go to where the average temperature in January is 0 degrees or above. Here's what they sound like. Oops, didn't mean to do that yet. Now they are strict vegetarians. They eat nothing but seeds. If they eat an insect, it's only by accident. And now that gives them an advantage when it comes to one of the parasitic birds. If you've heard of the cowbird, the brown-headed cowbird, Brown-headed cowbirds evolved following the herds of bison, and so they didn't have time to stop and nest. So their evolutionary strategy is they go and lay eggs in other birds' nests. Now what happens is when those parent birds come back, they don't realize that that's not their egg, and so they will incubate that egg, they will hatch it, and the cowbird tends to be bigger and will oftentimes either hog all the food or they'll shove the other babies out of the nest. And so they survive that way. But with the goldfinch, if a cowbird lays an egg in a goldfinch nest, the cowbird babies can't survive on that all seed diet. They're not built to do it. So oftentimes the cowbird hatchling will actually starve to death because they can't get enough food and they can't get enough calories from that all seed diet. Now this is their summer plumage, and they are the state bird of Iowa. Now this is another one of my personal favorites, the tufted titmouse. I just think they're neat looking. They got this little mohawky tuft sticking up, often heard before they're seen. So they say, Peter, Peter, Peter. And they really like sunflower seeds, and they're another bird that will hoard food. So they'll actually create a cache. And if you see a tufted titmouse at your feeder, chances are that bird has a cache somewhere within about 130 feet on average of the feeder. Now they nest in tree cavities. So again, and they can't make those on their own. So they rely on those standing dead trees and holes created by woodpeckers in order to have a nesting site. Now, one of my favorite things about the tufted titmouse, and one of the reasons I like them so much, is they will line their nest with the hair from other animals, and oftentimes they pluck it straight from live animals. Now, the people that do this sort of thing have collected that hair and analyzed it, and they have ID'd hair from raccoons, possums, mice, woodchucks, squirrels, livestock like cows and horses, rabbits, dogs and cats, and even humans. So that's a bold move for a little bird like that to be plucking hair off of live animals. But I got to give them credit. That's pretty cool. Now some other birds you might see, house finches, which are very pretty, right here on the left. House sparrows, which are actually considered an invasive species, and they oftentimes will come in large groups, and they can clean out your feeder pretty quick. This is a pine siskin. This is another bird that shows up in winter. Now, there are other things that might show up at your feeder, and not necessarily for the seed, sometimes for the seed. But one of those things are these, the Cooper's hawk and the sharp-shinned hawk. Now these guys aren't interested in your bird seed. They are interested in the birds that are eating at your bird feeder. So these hawks, which are two of the smallest hawks we have in Nebraska, they feed on songbirds. Now sometimes this upsets people. They don't like to see their pretty little songbirds, their sweet songbirds getting killed by hawks. And I like to think of it this way. I've heard this description for other predator-prey relationships, and I really like it. If a songbird gets eaten by a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk, that's no doubt about it. That's a bad day for that songbird. But it's a good day for the hawk, because the hawk has to eat too. So, and these relationships in nature kind of help keep things in check. So, if you think about the fact that house sparrows are invasive, and they're kind of a pest in some ways, our sharp-shinned hawks and our Cooper's hawks are eating them, and so they are serving some purpose. Now, I bet you didn't know that there's something called a resident Canada goose. Now, we've been seeing geese in the wintertime, and we tend to think of geese as being migratory. And there's a lot of subspecies of Canada goose. So some of those subspecies are migratory. They nest up in the tundra, and they fly south in the winter, but not all of these subspecies are migratory. These resident Canada goose are actually reside and nest in the lower 48 states year-round. So they only move south if the winter conditions are such that it limits their access to food and open water. So they'll just move south far enough to get food and open water. So that's why in Nebraska, if we have open water, like a lot of times some of our parks and golf courses will have like aerators in their ponds, and that keeps the water from freezing solid. So a lot of times geese gather there, or sometimes in the winter, the river doesn't freeze solid, so the geese will gather there. Now, resident Canada geese were actually, at the beginning of the 19th century, or the beginning of the 20th century, were actually extirpated from most of their range. They were gone. Unregulated hunting, egg collection, habitat destruction, all had taken their toll. So the largest subspecies, called the giant Canada goose, in the 1930s was actually thought to be extinct. But a remnant population was found in the 1960s. Sorry, I'm checking to make sure my computer's still plugged in. My battery was low. They were thought to be extinct until a remnant population was found in the 1960s. So they set about to restore the populations of these resident species, and they were restored using captive geese that had been used either as food, so they were being raised for food, or as live decoys. So, and as a group, geese are pretty long-lived. Now, migratory species tend to have low reproductive rates, but a high survival rate. Now, migration is a risky business. So if you migrate up north and you're nesting and there's a sudden cold snap or a storm, then that can have some devastating consequences on those migratory species. So migration is kind of a boom and bust. If conditions are good, they have a boom, everybody survives, everybody migrates. But if conditions are bad, then that might not happen. Now, being a resident species has an advantage there. So they tend to have higher reproductive and survival rates. They nest and reproduce at a younger age, and they tend to have higher success. The other thing about the resident species is if they nest and then something happens, there's a bad storm, then they have time to have a second clutch, where migratory species don't. Those species, they have their young need to hatch and be ready to migrate when it's time to migrate. So the resident species have an advantage over the migratory ones, excuse me, because they can always retry and have a second chance. Now, the other advantage that they have is a lot of our resident species will nest or gather in parks or golf courses or neighborhoods, and that protects them from hunting, because those are all areas where we're not hunting them. So they've really adapted to living near humans, sometimes, to our dismay, because if you've ever been around large groups of geese, they kind of make a mess. But I thought that was interesting. I never realized that there were resident species of Canada goose, and that's why I always thought, oh, we just see them around. But they're grazers, so they like new shoots, and they like waste grain. So after we harvest, the corn and things, especially in Iowa and Nebraska, you'll see large flocks of geese out in the fields, and they're cleaning up that waste grain. Now, if you're feeding birds, you're feeding squirrels, whether you want to or not. Squirrels are very smart, they're very resourceful, and they'll go after your bird seeds. And raccoons too. I used to have a raccoon. I had to start bringing in one of my bird feeders at night, because it was supposed to be predator proof, but the raccoons would actually knock it all the way off the hook. So if you, these two bottom ones are actual squirrel feeders. They're made for squirrels. This one's got a glass jar. You put peanuts in there and then you can watch. There's several different ones like this. I actually have one that I haven't put up yet, but you put peanuts in here, and then when the squirrel comes in to get a peanut, it looks like it has a unicorn head, and you can all have a good laugh at the squirrel's expense a little bit. If you want to fall down a YouTube hole, look up, go on YouTube and search for squirrel obstacle courses. And there are people who have set up these elaborate obstacle courses in their yards, a lot of times one obstacle at a time, and the squirrels will learn to traverse these obstacle courses in order to get to their favorite seeds. It's actually very entertaining. Now they do make squirrel-proof feeders, and I put proof in quotation marks. This one has a weighted bar, so a bird is not going to be heavy enough to move that bar, but if the squirrel gets on there, it'll actually pull a cover down over that opening in those, and so the squirrel can't access those seeds. This feeder is kind of a two-pronged approach. Up top here is what's called a squirrel baffle. So if a squirrel comes from the top, that baffle will tip side to side and the squirrel will fall off. This one also has spring loaded, so if a squirrel gets on here, maybe jumps from here, from this railing, it'll pull covers down over those seed openings and keep the squirrel, or at least attempt to keep the squirrel from getting to the seed. Now again, if you're putting out seed, you might be feeding other things, especially if you're near Fontenelle Forest. Turkeys are common in my yard, summer and winter, and they would actually, my low-hanging feeders, I would watch them do just this. This isn't a picture of my yard, but it could have been. And deer also will come for those seeds. So that's all I have today. If you'd like to become a member of the forest or make a donation, please visit our website or give our front desk a call. If you'd like a catalog of topics, or if you want to book a private program like this one, you can get a hold of me. Email is usually best. And we do want to thank our sponsors. Because of COVID, we weren't able to have our annual big fundraiser this year. And these are the companies and people who still gave generously and allow us to keep bringing you program even during quarantine times. So if there's any questions, I can try to answer them.
Hi, this is Carolyn again. Are there any birds that like fruit or worms? I forgot what you call worms, but to put out.
Like grubs?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the northern flickers like grubs. I've never tried putting them out in the winter time, so I'm not sure if they would come for them or not, but you can actually get suet that has grubs embedded in it. So sometimes you can find that depending on where you go. So a lot of the birds probably would, and a lot of our robins actually stick around all winter too. We think of them as being migratory and, you know, a sign of spring, but like last winter, I saw robins all winter long, so.
I have in the past thrown like stale bread out, but I don't know if bread is good or bad for birds.
Yeah, most of the time they don't consider bread to be good because it's just not high energy, especially in the winter time. It's just kind of filler. So, you know, they kind of discourage. It's kind of discouraged to throw out a lot of bread. You know, crust is not going to be a big deal, and the squirrels will eat them too. But, you know, we used to, when I was growing up, we used to take, you know, loaves of bread to the duck pond and feed the ducks, and nowadays they say that that's not a great idea.
Okay, that's all I had.
Okay. All right, well, if there's no other questions, I will say goodbye and we'll see you next month. And hopefully we'll get the problems with Facebook Live sorted out so that we can go live on Facebook again. So
Thank you.
thank you.